So they put somebody whose job is to promote logging in charge of this task force that's supposed to be objective. We point that out, and then we're told, don't target a specific staff member. Welcome, Wild Ones. This is Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. I want to talk to you about a strange phenomenon I have been witnessing recently when engaging with decision makers and gatekeepers. I will be the first to admit that the way I personally do advocacy is more of a yang than yin. And I wrote a piece about that, the yin yang of environmental movement. And that's at Substack. And I can include that if you want to read that, so I don't have to go into all of that. But the gist is that some of us have a more assertive approach than others, right? And after talking to a fellow named Lyle Lewis, who used to be a part of government agencies, and him basically saying the squeaky wheel gets the grease, as in those willing to, push the issue are the ones that end up making some change inside the agencies. So I'm going to keep going on that. I think the yin approach is also important, and I'm a part of that, and Eco Integrity Alliance is also a part of that. But overall, we feel like the yang is missing, and that's what we want to do, but we want to do it with the yang light and not the yang shadow. The shadow might be the more hidden or potentially negative, detrimental aspects. Okay, so with that caveat out of the way that not every communication is perfect, I've been seeing some weird stuff, and I want to go over these 3 instances that have happened just in the past few months. And I want you to tell me, is the communication that we're putting out inappropriate? And if so, what suggestions do you have? If not, what do you suspect we do about this new tactic to silence us? So here is the first piece that came down the pipeline a few months ago. Let's see, this email was in February, so this was a little ways ago, but this is dealing with, in Colorado, there is something called the Ponderosa Pine Mountain Pine Beetle Task Force, and we call it the Beetlemania Task Force, and that's not what we got in trouble for. And basically, it is to look at this latest natural wave of the native pine beetle, and we're having the newest version of that about 10 years after the previous wave peaked, maybe 14 years later, and everyone was saying the sky was falling, everything's gonna die, fires everywhere. Turned out to be not the case. Turned out to be that we now have a body of science showing, oh wow, beetles, believe it or not, do not increase the risk, likelihood of landscape-wide wildfire. And in fact, in some cases, it's the opposite of that. So this task force was formed with all of this histrionics and clearly a wildfire logging agenda. And nearly every single member of the task force is some of the, I would say, worst people in the state working on the issue of public lands management. We call it a who's who of who's logging public lands in Colorado. You can check out those articles to go more in depth. So let's just say that we have some major concerns with the makeup of this entity, the Beetle Task Force, which was organized by the Governor Jared Polis, and Department of Natural Resources as part of it as well. And we said, hey, we'd really like to see some independent scientists and conservationists on the task force. So we tried to set up meetings. Long story short, they refused. They said maybe they'll meet with some scientists and possibly have them on a working group, which still hasn't happened as of August. So we have some major concerns with that, but that's neither here nor there. I just wanted to give some background. So the leader of this entity is the task force is the Department of Natural Resources Assistant Director for Forest Health and Wildfire Mitigation. So this person's job is to promote logging and to make links between wildfire and logging, and frankly, in the past, beetles and logging. And these are some of the folks at Department of Natural Resources. They testified against a bill that would have taken some of the millions and potentially tens of millions in logging dollars in the state, some of which we wanted to go towards home hardening, so grants for low-income, elderly, and disabled residents in the fire plain. They testified against that. Do not take any of our logging money to protect homes, the one thing that actually works to protect communities. So that's the Department of Natural Resources. So we expressed concerns about this person, not the individual human being, but the role itself as being in charge. And this was the response from the Director of Policy at Department of Natural Resources. I won't name any names because I don't want to make a personal attack by naming a human who is doing things. Get to that later. Anyway, so I do want to note that I do not appreciate your characterization of DNR professional staff as the department's Assistant Director for Forest Health and Wildfire Mitigation, blank, leads policy development and implementation on forestry and wildfire mitigation issues. She has extensive experience in forestry, forest health, blah, 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 blah. I ask that you keep your comments to the issues identified in the task force meeting agendas and refrain from targeting specific staff members. Okay, so there was no targeting. There was no personal attacks on this individual whatsoever. The statements that were made, and I will find the exact email mentioning this individual, have to do with the position of the individual, which is to promote logging and promoting, yes, misinformation and disinformation linking forests and wildfire and community concerns and beetles, and that person being in charge of the task force. So now I'm going to find my email that I specifically said this about it. Unfortunately, many of us in the conservation community are pretty concerned that someone whose position, forest health and wildfire mitigation, seems based almost entirely on the industry perspective of, quote, forestry, namely forests as, quote, timber and, quote, fuel, that she will not be truly open to an ecological scientific perspective. This is the same office that has already put out information that is counter to well-known consensus science on this issue of beetles and wildfire. We're concerned that someone in her position is leading the task force and worried that all appointments will simply be those who share those views, namely that beetles cause wildfire and that landscape-wide tree removal will stop beetles and or prevent wildfires, certainly a perspective, but debatable at best. Is there any way to ensure that those coming from an ecological scientific perspective and not affiliated with any potential conflicts of interest in terms of industry and agencies will also be a part of this task force? And so that was the email that they said was saying, do not target specific staff members. So they put somebody whose job is to promote logging in charge of this task force that's supposed to be objective. We point that out, and then we're told, don't target specific staff member. So even notice just that language, targeting. Like that's pretty violent language suggesting that, hey, this person's job is to do this, and here they are in this position. So that was that piece. Okay, maybe just a one-off. Maybe the wording wasn't great. Should we have not mentioned the person? In fact, I never did mention the name. But so what do you think about that? Would you say that the email I had sent, because I'll take responsibility for that, was wrong to mention this person's position as head of the task force? So again, not singling out one member. This is the head of the task force. And was the director of policy right to say that we shouldn't be targeting the staff member? Leave that up to you, whatever you think. So tell me about that. That's issue number one. Number two, we are dealing in my neighborhood, which is against the national forest and also county open space with this idea that they want to punch a road in that would go basically over a mile through the forest on public lands as an extra route out in case of a wildfire. Now, personally, I am not opposed to the idea of an egress route in certain circumstances. I do think that certain neighborhoods are less likely than others as candidates, and I would argue now at this point that this neighborhood is not suited. So we initially pushed back against this route where they wanted to go through the one patch of old growth forest in this sensitive wetland and basically just plow through that with 16-foot wide roads and turnouts that are even wider. So many of us said, you should do it somewhere else. The spot they want to do it is also in mature, approaching old growth forest in another riparian area, and it's extremely steep. And I went out there, I led a hike because the town itself was going to, and then they didn't. So I led a hike out there for folks to take a look at it. Every single person on the hike thought it was unfeasible and ridiculous. It was taking us all the way into the forest, and then it would maybe take it back around this other mountain. It's absurd. It'd be a road to nowhere. So after a couple years of saying, I think there should be an egress, but not in this old growth, maybe this other route, I decided to say, listen, I'm going to stand aside on this. I'm no longer going to promote it. I'm not going to officially oppose it, but I'm concerned this is just going to be for more logging and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so that was where it stood. And then there was some communications with the new mayor of this town of Nederland. And basically, this was an email I got from the mayor as soon as I stopped supporting the egress. This is what the mayor said, whose name will go unknown because that would be a personal attack to mention an elected official's name. As I said, disagreement is just fine, but don't tell me we are advocating to build an emergency egress road to, quote, check a box, which is a personal attack just because you disagree with our approach. You and I have never had a face-to-face discussion about this, so how in the world would you know my motivations? Plus, you are dismissing the time, energy, data, and modeling that has gone into this, the countless letters and conversations with our residents for years. Okay, that's an interesting thing. So claiming that this matter is a personal attack. Well, here is what I had emailed. So, well, let me actually go back to a previous email of hers, and then I will explain my response. So the previous email before that one was, Josh, if you were paying attention to our strategic planning process in the meeting we had last Tuesday, you would know that emergency communication systems were at the top of the list. Pause. I was at that meeting and I was paying attention, and I thought that was a very strange way for my elected official to communicate to me. But let's go on. Let's agree to disagree. I'm advocating for the items like communication systems and community-driven tactics, a resilient and holistic approach, in addition to an egress route, so that in the unfortunate situation where we have to evacuate our residents, we can. Do you have children, Josh? I'm not opposed to cutting down some trees so that my children have a way to escape if they need it. If you feel confident enough you can get your kids out of Big Springs Road and Peakview Road or cut off, then you should be showing that. Show the community how they can do it that doesn't put them in danger. Why don't you show them on Facebook? And if you can show me a route that doesn't put more lives in danger, doesn't create the chimney and upslope effects, blah, blah, blah. As I said, I'm open to hearing ideas that work. That second part of that, that's fine, but we'll move on here and then I'll comment. But do not continue to debate me on not building the road. And furthermore, until you know your elected officials and you understand their motivations, I would suggest not claiming they're doing it to check a box. Maybe if you were the one receiving letters from our Big Springs community saying they are scared of them or their children dying, you might think differently. Okay, so my response to that email, and then we'll get to that last email, was in the recent Board of Trustees meeting, you said how important it was for people to feel like they could disagree without being shut down or told it's inappropriate to disagree. Just offer my opinion. So then I said, so if you were a constituent and were politely offering a viewpoint for something that directly impacts you and a topic you have been working on for decades and was told, quote, do not continue to debate with me, unquote, or, quote, if you were paying attention, unquote, and then turning the conversation personal, what does me having kids or not have to do with the objective reality of the situation? What would you think about the openness of your elected official to represent the facts on the ground or listen to feedback? Facts remain that we just had another fire. No one in the neighborhood was alerted. The first priority is clearly not being addressed. And then I said at the end, none of this should be personal. We're discussing information and opinions. I don't appreciate being spoken to in such a manner by anyone, much less those elected to represent my voice. Was that right of me? I don't know. That's up to you to decide. But so then the next piece was that person saying that when I had mentioned check a box, which I'll mention in a second, is a personal attack. So I had to go back to find what this person was talking about. So basically, this was the sentence I had written that they said was a personal attack, the mayor. I personally think it's time we start focusing more on what actually protects people from wildfire rather than what feels psychologically comfortable or the political optics of having checked a box. So most of what we're doing right now is logging forests and pretending that's protecting communities, which we know at this point it doesn't, and it can actually make things worse. And we have been talking about early warning systems here, and we've had these multiple fires, one that burned down a third of the town, which was a town fire, not anything to do with wildfire. And then this other fire nearby, people were not alerted. So we're pointing out the low-hanging fruit, including home hardening, which many of the logging entities they killed that bill. That yes, it seems to be about checking a box, saying we did something. That is my viewpoint on what the political process is at this point. It is elected officials saying, all right, we got to do something. The thing we need to do, home hardening, would be expensive and it would get money towards individuals, which makes it complicated. So let's just cut down public forests. And then in this case, like punch random roads through every piece of public land and call it a day. And so, again, there may be some fair points made on the other side, but the issue that I'm coming down to is, do you feel as if it was a personal attack for me to say that sentence? Again, I personally think it's time we start focusing more on what actually protects people from wildfire rather than what feels psychologically comfortable or the political optics of having checked a box. Didn't say, hey, you. But even if I did, even if I said, hey, Mayor, I feel like this is about political optics, that's some pretty run-of-the-mill communications with an elected official. And we know for a fact that entities in Colorado and federally are intentionally suppressing science. We know this for a fact because they had admitted it in emails saying, don't go toe-to-toe on the science. And they admit that we're making valid points, but publicly they claim otherwise. So it's not even a question anymore about whether there is some bad faith by our government entities. So it is a fair thing to suggest, hey, a lot of this seems like it's about looks rather than actually accomplishing it. So it's like feeling good rather than doing good. Is that a personal attack is my question. So this came up this second time. And I was like, man, I've studied nonviolent communication. I go over the words that I write. At the same time, yeah, I'm going to be assertive in my communications and blunt. At this point, there is no reason to pretend that there isn't false information being intentionally spread and differing viewpoints that are intentionally suppressed. That there is no more time for that debate. That is a fact. We have proven it over and over and over again. These entities suppressing their own studies because it disproves what they're doing. That discussion's over. The discussion is, what are we going to do now? And basically, I think what's happening is we're backing them into a corner, and the only thing they have is basically saying, we're all nice people here. Why aren't you being nice? And it's like, I am. I'm being extremely nice. I personally think it's time we start focusing more. And then the same person who is saying, Don't make personal taxes, saying to me very rudely, if you were paying attention to our strategic planning process in the meeting we had last Tuesday, talk about making assumptions. I was paying attention. Do you have children, Josh? Maybe if you were the one receiving letters saying they're scared of children dying, you might think differently. All personal there. So it's like, let's have some rules. So that was the second thing. And at that point, I was like, just take me off this thread. This is not in good faith. If I can't even engage in this way, the truth is you can't say anything they don't want to hear in any way. But this is the last one, and it happened this morning. And maybe I am the a-hole here, okay? Maybe I am. Now, that's why I'm asking you this. So I'm going to find out what you think, and this is what prompted this. So I will start with my email and then get the response. So there was an email posted to this listserv run by a couple of, let's just say, more yin environmental groups in Colorado. They've been engaging a little bit more on the issue, but I have to say they've mostly sidestepped it. But we have somebody involved with them who is changing some of this. So that much is good. So anyway, I haven't engaged much on this listserv, but there was a post for this 2026 Open Space Research Symposium. And I was like, oh, that's interesting to me. Wildlife, ecosystems, biodiversity, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, who's it being run by? Oh, City of Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks, Jefferson County Open Space, Boulder County, City of Longmont, all entities that have been front and center at all of this logging and suppression of science and promoting disinformation and silencing and attacking critics. Every single one of them. There are the central entities. We have all of these emails from a Colorado Open Records Act that proves all of that. So I was like, man, one more thing of these. And I was like, well, this is a nature listserv. Let me post an email about this. So you all tell me, Josh, you've gone too far, man. Personal attacks. Here's what I said. Now, just keep in mind, the person who posted this is not affiliated with these entities anyway. Thanks for posting this, person. Based on who is hosting this, I'm afraid this is going to be our government land managers trying to convince us how great industrial logging is across open space, including clear-cutting, big tree logging, while sidestepping the consensus of peer-reviewed science and acknowledging not a single drawback of what they've been doing. Jefferson County is doing some of the most destruction I've ever seen under the guise of, quote, fuel reduction, unquote, in my 20 years of monitoring these projects, and I'm afraid they no longer have any credibility on this topic, while the other governments involved haven't been much better and have ignored nearly 100% of engagement from the scientific, conservation, and forest edge communities. Do any conservationists plan to attend, and will any critique be allowed, or is it just another dog and pony show to tell us what they're planning while pretending they're open to engagement? All right, assertive. I'm talking to other enviros. Don't mention any names. I mentioned government land managers, the government agencies. So seems like that would be fine. Now, this is the person who runs the listserv. They let it through, which was nice, but this was a caution to me. This is one of my first posts, so I get dinged right away. I am letting you know that it is skirting the edge of list policy about attacking ideas, not people. The list is actively moderated. Okay, I better not mess up again. So I was like, okay, so attacking ideas, which is just a weird attacking, not people. I was like, so this was my response. Thanks, person. I made certain not to mention any people. I referred solely to government agencies which are carrying out these practices. Can you help me understand where that may come close to crossing a line so I can avoid doing so, or whether I can engage with the list on these topics? For instance, would we not be able to mention elected officials or those in charge of decision-making, some of whom are, yes, individual people, but in authority positions, not simply citizens? Then this person responded to me, which I appreciate. I don't have anything necessarily against this individual. You can certainly mention people by name, but the focus still needs to be on the policy or issue, not name calling. Okay. The first two paragraphs do discuss forest management as an issue. The issue is really the last sentence with terms such as dog and pony show and pretending. Those terms are about the people, indicating they act in bad faith. And that's why I had to think about this a bit. So then going on, many land managers subscribe to this list. I see. There's the rub. If your goal is to persuade them and others of something, you might want to think of them as part of your audience. You catch more flies with honey than with vinegar, as the old saying goes. After I took a few breaths, I actually checked in with a couple people on the list who both said everything you said is completely appropriate. But anyway, maybe they're wrong. I'm asking you all. This is my response. I don't know why I bothered at this point. I'm probably kicked off the list at this point. But I said, I agree with rules and drawing lines on personal attacks, but I didn't call anyone names, which is my understanding of personal attacks, or, quote, name calling, as in names directed at people to demean them as opposed to tackling the arguments they are making. If the idea is that because there are human beings who work at the agencies and therefore pointing out the reality as I see it on the ground is a, quote, personal attack, that leaves almost no room for critique. We're past the point where we can just claim these are honest disagreements. It is a fact that the very agencies hosting this event routinely host events where land management, blah, blah, blah. All right, I'm just going on and explaining what's been going on. But all right, here. That's why I use the pre-existing term dog and pony show to describe this common occurrence where a land management agenda is pre-decided with projects already funded and there is no meaningful room for feedback if they even allow it. So I said that dog and pony show, it's colorful but accurate, I'm afraid. And yes, I and the scores of volunteers I work with in Colorado do believe at this point that nearly all the events the agencies host aren't really about feedback, but pushing an agenda under the pretense of engagement when it comes to logging public lands, which is their main focus at this point. They simply don't listen and they promote disinformation every turn. And I mentioned the report that I put out that shows that they're absolutely doing all the things that she's accusing me of. And then I say, I am not sure it's possible to critique these agencies using the facts without upsetting some people. And, that's basically what it comes down to. So this is 3 times where I made comments that I feel like are pretty moderate and middle of the road, or at least polite, and are practicing nonviolent communication where I'm not doing attacks. I'm certainly not naming names, and I'm definitely not calling anyone names. Yet there is this distortion of what personal attack is, and then even name calling. Just that's incorrect. That's not what name calling is. So this was sort of a gatekeeper who is kind of part of the yin stuff and clearly has connections to these land managers who are on the list. So this may be a matter of standing up for their right to what? To promote disinformation and make personal attacks against us in media and things like that. So, but what do I know, right? I may be wrong. So what do you think? Was I in the wrong wholeheartedly for all of this? Are there improvements that could be made in the communications where, we need to critique what these government agencies are doing by taking our tax money, doing things without our permission, but in our name on public lands? Are we allowed to say we don't like this? And are we allowed to refer to the humans who are carrying out the actions? These aren't people who are just walking by on the street. They have chosen to be in these positions. An elected official, people who work for the government agencies who take tax money to do this work. I just don't understand the idea of what this line even is here. Don't mention individual roles in government as if it's just this amorphous blob, and don't act as if you know what they may be thinking, but I'm trying to figure out what they're thinking. And at this point, there are only a couple of options. They don't have enough information to promote things accurately and are intentionally refusing to learn new things. Or number 2, they know better and are lying on purpose and attacking anyone who disagrees in bad faith. There are no other options here. We're not saying that everything that the government agencies are doing or saying is wrong. Not saying everything that we're doing and saying on our side is incorrect, although we would like specific critiques so we can improve upon that. But at this point, they are keeping out any disagreement. Almost all in any disagreement is treated as beyond the pale. And I think what's happening is we got them in a corner. And this is their last tactic, is saying, look at how horrible these people, look at how mean they are by saying what we're actually doing. And I'm going to tell you, I'm not buying it. I don't buy it. I don't know how else to do this if I can't name what's going on in this situation. And yeah, there is some bad faith malfeasance going on in our government agencies. And that means humans are doing those actions. It doesn't make them irredeemable. It doesn't even mean that it is about them personally, but the roles that they are playing in the way this is set up at the government agencies and for elected officials means they are doing harmful things and they're not being honest. And someone has to say it. So I'm going to keep saying it unless you all tell me how I'm doing wrong. Or even better, I'll keep doing it and maybe you can help me improve ways to engage. Or is this just all more bad faith on their part? Is this more projection on their part where anything that they're accusing us of, they are themselves doing? Or are we all just imperfect human beings who are really just apes wearing clothes and using technology we don't understand? I don't know. Anyway, I want to hear what you have to say. This was a lot from my perspective. I really don't like making this stuff about me, but again, I am the person who is doing this stuff, and so I do expect some critique of my ideas. I would appreciate people not making personal attacks, and I try to never do the thing that I don't want done against me. So that's the way I do this. And at the same time, if you're an elected official, you do have a higher standard and you're a public figure, and we do get to criticize you. So what do you think? Enough out of me. Let's hear what you have to say.